Very warm welcome, everybody. So this is the Personal Resilience Workshop. My name's Peter. I've been running resilience workshops for about 10 years and been doing it at the RFC as well for a fair while. It's always a nice thing to do at one of the last sessions after what is always an inspiring but sometimes quite exhausting conference. So we've got an hour together. This session is going to be there's going to be an invitation for this to be interactive, but if you're not in that space and you just want to kind of listen and process, that's totally fine as well. There's no obligation to engage in anything. Charlotte, thanks. Yeah, if the form doesn't work for you for whatever reason, then just put your email address if you're comfortable in there. So I'm going to talk through a few exercises, a couple of specific tools around resilience and ways in which we can understand and prioritize our own resilience. It's a bit of a buzzword now, obviously. I mean, a lot of people heard about this idea of resilience, and certainly a lot more in common use now than it was a few years ago. I think as people start to understand that the world is changing very rapidly around us. But there's still quite a big gap between understanding what resilience means and what is good for us, and actually being able to put that into practice and prioritize our own resilience. And that's what I want to focus on. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides to talk through. So I'm going to start off just by setting a bit of context. And then the bulk of the session will be working through two particular exercises that I think are really useful tools, and we'll go through them together, but I'll invite you to take them away and use them in your own lives as well. I'm just going to, for those of you who just joined, I've just in the chat, there's afterwards I'll send an email with all of this stuff in, so don't feel like you have to take notes unless that's the way you like to learn. So that form I've just put into the chat box is somewhere you can just add your email address to make sure you get that follow-up email. Okay, great. At any point anyone's got any questions, do feel free to unmute yourself, jump in, put a question in the chat, and we can see where we go. There'll be a few points where I'll just invite for some thoughts, and we'll just see what happens. It might be that lots of people want to talk. It might be that no one wants to talk. It's totally fine. But just to start us off, I'm going to share my screen and talk through a couple of ideas just to get us going. So the theme of what I'm going to be talking about is around this idea of patterns. Okay, so as I said before, resilience is a familiar word to a lot of people, but we're not generally very good at understanding what that means in practice and what we do with it. So the frame that I like to use when I talk about resilience is this idea of patterns, because we are very good at identifying patterns. As human beings, we're naturally quite inclined to it. So I've just taken some examples of images from the natural world where we see repeating patterns a lot of the time, and we're good at noticing these. We're good at understanding them and recognizing what they're telling us. So these images talk to us about strength and power and efficiency and lots of positive, sometimes negative ideas. But I'm going to talk a bit about how this idea of recognizing patterns can be really useful for thinking about our own resilience. So the first thing to do is I want to talk through this idea of burnout. So I think it's useful when talking about resilience to talk about burnout, which is often seen as the kind of the binary counterpoint to resilience. And I don't think it's quite that simple, but it's a helpful place to start. And this is a tool that is from the excellent book In the Tiger's Mouth by Katrina Shields. And this is a rating scale. And we're not going to go into this in too much depth, but what I thought would be useful to start with this and to flag up the 10 questions that Katrina Shields puts out when asking people to think about, where am I within the realm of burnout? So I'll share this afterwards if you share your email address. So again, don't feel like you've got to copy it down, and this is all being recorded. But I want you to just have a quick look through those questions, and if you want to use that scoring system that she's got at the top, 0 to 5, then please do. But otherwise, I just invite you to have a quick read through those, and I'll give you another kind of 30 seconds just to have a look through. And as you're reading them, just think which of those feel easy to answer, which of those feel harder to answer? Which ones feel quite connected to this idea of burnout, where you are kind of mentally and physically exhausted and emotionally exhausted as well? And which ones feel a bit less relevant, that don't seem that useful to you to be thinking about? And as I say, if you are going through to score these, giving yourself a very rough score from those numbers at the top, the last thing is Katrina puts a scoring system together where you can kind of add up all of your scores, and this is what you get. I think this is a helpful way to start, but I'd really like, if anybody has any particular immediate responses to this, I'd be really curious to hear them, kind of positive or negative or somewhere in between. I can't see everyone at the moment, so I'll have a look at the chat, but please do feel free to unmute yourself if anybody wants to share any immediate responses to this tool. So one question I would ask would be, how useful does this feel? What do you feel like? Is this telling you anything useful about yourself? Or does it feel a bit kind of disconnected? Is it easy to answer? Is it quite difficult and challenging? Any thoughts about that? Again, feel free to put them in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and jump in, please do.
I can answer these questions.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I can answer them honestly, and they don't upset me in any way, having to answer them. And having just done a quick poll on myself, I think the answer was probably right. Okay,
that's good to know. Yeah, sometimes you get what you expect from something like this, and sometimes you very much don't. Any other thoughts on this before we move on?
I agree. Well, I mean, they're all quite, I can answer all of them. I'm not scared of them either. Some of them really apply and some of them really don't. So some of them are going to be very often or quite often, and some of them are going to be much more sort of ones or zeros. Okay. So that's quite interesting. There definitely seem to be two camps for me.
Thanks, Helen. So yeah, both of those comments I think really useful, and the reason I'm sharing this is not because I think it's an incredibly powerful and insightful tool. It's not. You can't score burnout in the same way that you can't score resilience. But this is a helpful way to get into this idea of patterns, because in itself, in an isolated experience, this isn't very useful. You're going to get a number out of this, but people might be scoring things in different ways. As we've heard, some of them might feel more relevant than others. Where this can be useful is where we can use it to start recognizing patterns. If we do it repeatedly, once a week, once a fortnight, once a month, once every 6 months, whatever feels right, then we can start to use it to notice patterns, because the numbers we give are pretty arbitrary when we do them once, but when we do them twice or 3 times, then they start to be about building up patterns. So if you score yourself, 25 the first time you go round, that doesn't really tell you anything. But if you score 25 once, and then next time you score 10, or the next time you score 40, that can start to tell you something. So you can start to recognize these patterns. And the thing I think it is very useful about this tool is that it's just an invitation to ask yourself some questions you might not otherwise ask. And as long as we don't place too much importance on it, because a lot of these could be indicators of something else, something about unreliable memory or about headaches or tiredness, could be related to lots of things that are not burnout. But it's a really helpful way of just checking in with yourself and starting to ask the questions that feel quite useful. So again, I will share this afterwards, and I'd invite you, get into the habit of doing this relatively regularly. Change the questions if there are some that you don't think are very useful or important. Add other ones if there are things you think are more useful. But really use it to start recognizing patterns and what's happening over time. Are they particularly higher in the summer rather than the winter, which might be connected to something like seasonal affective disorder or something kind of, a bit more low level than that. But it is a helpful way to start thinking in this idea of our behaviors and our experiences are patterns. So to talk about that in a bit more detail, I'm going to share another way to think about burnout that I think is a lot more kind of a helpful way to do it. And thanks, just seen some good comments in the chat. Yeah, Oliver, actually, you just kind of mentioned what I just said about seasonality, definitely. And I think, yeah, this is a really useful way to think about things over time. But a more helpful way to think about burnout is through something called a burnout cycle, which is something I've sort of slightly adapted from some of the research that's been done into burnout. There's not a lot of it, but I think this is a much more helpful way for us to think about it, rather than as something which is about a score or a particularly kind of binary on or off, burnt out or not burnt out experience, which is sometimes how we talk about it. So I'm going to talk through this cycle. And again, I invite you to think about how this might resonate for you. So it starts off with a desire to prove yourself. So this is something we all have to some degree. Okay, so we all have an idea of who we think we should be and who we think we are. And if those two ideas are close together, then that's fine. But if they become, if there's a gap between them, then it creates a tension, and one that we feel like we need to fill. We're not who we need to be, or who other people expect us to be, for example. So once we feel that, that can then lead to, we start to work harder. We put more of our energy into being this person we think we should be. And as we work harder, we start to neglect our own needs. We put them to the back burner and we focus on these other things, these external things that feel more important. We notice that there are conflicts within us around this new behavior, but we ignore them. We don't want to face them. And we start to revise our values. So the things that were important to us, we kind of quieten down and replace them with the things like, pleasing our employer, or getting a particular high score in an exam, or something like that. We start to change our values and what is important to us. At some point, this leads to denial. Again, we recognize there's a problem, but we don't want to face it because it's painful and it's difficult and it's hard to face. So we put it away. We might withdraw as well. It might be that other people are reaching out to us, but we withdraw from those conversations and those experiences because we don't really know how to handle them. And again, they're uncomfortable, they're painful. And then at some point, this behavioral change becomes obvious to other people. It becomes obvious to ourselves, but very much noticed by others. And you can look at this as a kind of a linear cycle down, but actually it's much more helpful to think of it as a cycle. And to do that, all we need to do is add one more arrow, which is bringing us from the bottom right back up to the top again. Because what happens when our behavior change becomes obvious to other people is it triggers this desire to prove ourselves all over again, because we think that other people think that we can't cope, or we can't handle it, or we're not being the person that we think we're supposed to be. And this is how the cycle works. It just goes round and round and round and round. And this is what burnout is for most people. You might get to the much more severe sides of it, which really link into into depression and some really severe kind of mental health challenges. But this is a much more common form of burnout, of being somewhere on this cycle. So again, when we think of burnout as a binary idea, it's really hard for us to recognize how it relates to us. But when we see it as a cycle and as a pattern, it's much easier for us to sort of see ourselves where we might be within that, because these aren't tick boxes. We have to be able to kind of check off to confirm that we are, in need of a bit of support or in need of some kind of rest. But if we can start noticing how these patterns might play out for us, then we can start to recognize them and do something about it. And you might want to change all of the language. So for instance, a desire to prove yourself, we could replace that with the idea of uncertainty, which is obviously a really prevalent idea at the moment, things being very uncertain. And that might be something that actually tips us over into this cycle of wanting to work harder, because we don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow. There's not a lot that we can rely on or fall back on. So you can change the language. But thinking about burnout and thinking about exhaustion or tension or stress in this kind of way, it is a much more helpful way of doing it than just waiting until we're so exhausted that we literally have to stop. We can't get out of bed in the morning. And this doesn't happen overnight. This is something that we practice and we get better at over time. But I think it's a helpful way to start. So before I move on to the first of the two tools I wanted to go through in a bit more detail, I just want to check if there's any questions on any of that, if that makes sense before I move on. Again, feel free to put something in the chat or unmute, but it looks like that makes sense so far. So I'm going to move on to the first exercise. So this is something I'm going to talk through, and then I'll invite you to do a little, either in your head or if you've got a piece of paper to hand, something just to kind of to put this into practice a little bit. And what I'm going to talk about is this idea of drivers. So we talked a bit about what burnout is, and then to think about, okay, well, how do we promote our own resilience? We have to think about, well, where does our tendency to burnout come from? What are the behaviors or the ideas that might push us in the wrong direction that we need to be aware of and to be able to counteract? And the reason that they're called drivers is because these are kind of the voices in our head that push us towards behavior that is exhausting, that is stressful, and that is, from a kind of a logical perspective, quite irrational. And I'm going to go through these. There's 5 drivers here. It borrows a lot of language that you might be familiar with from things like transactional analysis. So if you're familiar with them, great. And if you're not, don't worry about it. I'll explain exactly what these mean. So the first one is be perfect, right? So this is the voice in your head that tells you that everything you do has to be 100% right. Okay, if you get 99% of something right, you focus on that 1%. Think, why didn't I do that? That's the thing that really bugs me and keeps me up at night. And if you get anything wrong, then you failed. Number 2 is try hard. So this is, you've got to put so much effort into everything you do. You've got to put all of yourself into everything. And if you slow down or you take a break, then you failed and you've let people down. Driver number 3 is be pleasing. So this is a very popular one. This is the idea you've got to make everybody else in the world happy. That's the most important thing. You've got to please everybody. You've got to make sure everyone you meet comes away liking you and thinking you're a great person. And if you meet anybody and they seem like they're not immediately thrilled with you, then you feel like, oh no, I've messed up there. That's the person that I'm going to focus on. Number 4 is hurry up. So again, pretty obvious. You've got to do everything super quickly. You're in a rush all of the time. You can't slow down. You've got to do all of these things yesterday, and there's no opportunity to kind of go slow and relax. And then driver number 5 is be strong. So this is the idea that you can't show any weakness. You've got to be able to cope with everything that everyone throws at you, and you've just got to be able to put up with it. And if you struggle, or if you find anything difficult, then you've failed and you've let people down. So these are the 5 drivers. And it's important to say that you might notice some of these things and think, actually, there's elements of these things that can be positive, right? I mean, and that's absolutely true. It's nice to want to please people. It's nice to want to try hard. And if that's how you feel about them, then that's fine. They're not drivers. The way to think about when they become drivers is when they are irrational, when they are bottomless pits of energy that you can never, ever fill up, right? So if, for example, be perfect for you is something like, it's important for me to do well. I want to do as well as I possibly can in this thing. Great, that's fine. But if it's, I actually want to be perfect. And if I'm not perfect, if I don't get everything right, that's really going to bug me. And that's going to be something I focus on. Then that's when it becomes a driver, because it's about controlling something we don't actually have control over. It's impossible to be perfect, in the same way that it's impossible to please everybody, in the same way that it's impossible to put all of your energy into everything that you do. These things are irrational, and we know that they're irrational. But when we're not thinking about it, when we're not conscious about it, these are very alluring ideas that really do drive a lot of our behavior. So what I want you to do, and again, you can do this in your head or you can do this on a piece of paper, is going to do a bar graph, because obviously everyone loves bar graphs. And I'll just give an example. So what I want you to do is just kind of scale how these are important for you relatively. So for example, for me, be strong is not that important. hurry up, yes, that's quite important. Be pleasing is like way over here. Try hard is huge, and be perfect, kind of middling importance there. So that would be how it would look for me. And that's different from how it would look for me a year ago and 10 years ago. This does change over time, but it's a helpful way to think about, okay, which are the ones for me that really, really drive me, that really kind of trigger that kind of behavior that is quite unhelpful, that makes me put a lot of effort into something that I cannot control. Because this is really what resilience is. This is the core of resilience. Resilience is about not trying to control things that we cannot control, choosing where we put our energy, which sounds easy when we say it like that, but obviously is not an easy thing to do. So again, I'll just leave a pause, and if anybody wants to share how they found that exercise or anything that comes up for them doing that, it'd be really interesting to hear. No pressure if you'd rather not, but any of them that feel particularly strong or feel particularly confusing. So as you're thinking, one question I think is quite helpful to think about in this is not just how this relates to you, but also how strong are these messages in when you're engaging with other people. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute. We have a slight break from that. But one thing that's really helpful to think about drivers is, okay, how might I be putting them onto other people? And it's useful to notice maybe a discrepancy between your answers now. So again, I'll give you a couple of examples. So for me, be pleasing is quite a strong driver. And I'm kind of aware of that, and that's helpful, but it's still very much there. But when I think about, well, do I expect other people to be like that? I then notice that I don't hold other people to the same standards I might hold myself. So I want to please everybody, but if I meet someone and they don't please me, I don't think badly of them necessarily. I don't think of them what I expect people to think of me if I don't please them. And that really helps kind of, okay, it shines a light on the irrationality of that thought. And it doesn't make it go away. It doesn't solve everything, but it's like the monsters under the bed. If you shine a light on them, it really does help kind of take away some of that sort of menace and some of that dread that surrounds these ideas when they're just unconscious in your own head. But counterpoint to that, for me, try hard is really important. And when I think about it, I definitely do project those onto other people. I do expect other people to try hard because it's important to me, but it might not necessarily be important to them. And again, that helps me recognize, again, the sort of the irrationality of that. And not everybody's expecting me to put all of my effort into everything I do, just in the same way that they might not expect that of themselves as well. And so another kind of part of this exercise is it's a helpful thing to put into, to bring into teams, to do this with colleagues, friends, group members, even families, to understand, okay, what are their drivers? What are their triggers? What are the messages that I really want to avoid when I'm engaging with them? Because if you are helping someone to do something or asking someone to do something, if you start accidentally using the language of one of their main drivers, it could really have a detrimental effect. You could push them in the wrong direction and they just get stressed out, unable to do the thing. And so it's really helpful to have this conversation. So just going to address a couple of questions in here. So Georgia asks, would you measure these efforts based on how much energy they take to exert, or more whether they are core principles for you? Really good question. I think I would focus more on the energy thing, because the principles, again, some of those can be positive. The idea of be pleasing as a principle can be a positive driver, but it's about that energy and think about the point. Is there a point where that's enough, where you please people enough, or you've tried hard enough, or you've been perfect enough? And if there is, that's probably okay. But if that point doesn't exist, then that's something that needs attention. What's about them being compelling? Really good suggestion. One of them could be effective. Yeah, I mean, that's, again, these are slightly arbitrary frameworks are put around very complex behavior, and if there's other language that feels more important or more useful, then please do go for that. So yeah, be effective. You might want to think about, does that replace any of the others, or does that combine any of the others, or is that a completely different one? So Kate's mentioned about using other people's perceptions of how they're doing as a driver, which is really helpful way to think about it. How do you think other people are perceiving you? So it helps to remove the option to just quit, but means you put a lot of pressure on yourself. And yeah, that point, that last point in your comment, none of these people mean to put that on me, it's all me. That's kind of the point we want to get to. Not just saying that, but really believing it and understanding it, that our drivers are all in our own head. And they might be triggered by things other people do, but they are things that we can, over time, diminish and get over and replace. And we might not be able to get rid of them completely, or that might take, years of therapy, for example, or they might not be. But the more we are conscious of them and recognize the patterns as they pop up, the more we can respond to them and be aware of them and not put all of our energy into trying to fulfill something that is irrational. And again, this is not a magic fix. It's not this will change everything overnight. But doing an exercise like this and doing it with other people, sharing that kind of language and understanding what's important to them, making sure they understand what's important to you, is a really helpful way of generating positive patterns. So moving away from the negative patterns that drivers can bring, where we kind of get into that spiral and we can never ever fill. We just keep putting more of ourselves into filling this hole that can't be filled. Instead, we can start to try find different language or support people to understand how we can do it differently. A really small example of that, and this might seem a little bit trivial, but it stuck with me, as I was giving this workshop to some community activists, and there was a woman there who said, she was one of the people for, be pleasing was really strong. And she did a lot of work in her community. And because of that, she was one of the people that everyone else went to when something needed to be done. And I'm sure we can all kind of relate to either being that person maybe, or knowing who that person might be. You do things, you're known for doing things, then people come to you and say, oh, and can you do this other thing? And it is mad on the surface of it, because, the person who's doing the loads of things already is probably not the person who's got capacity to do more things, but it's who we're drawn to ask. And what she found was she found it very hard to say no, to say, I can't do that. Partly because being pleasing was such a strong driver. She thought, well, if I'm not seen as someone who does that, who am I? What is my identity? But partly because there was something implicit for her in the phrase, I can't do that was sort of suggesting I should be able to do that, but I can't. So it was kind of really internalizing the fault and the blame for that. And a really simple thing, the way she got around that was to change what she said. She said, when people asked her, instead of saying, I can't do it, she said, it's not possible. And again, it's a really small thing. Again, it's not going to change everything. But for her, it was just a kind of externalizing that idea. It's not that I can't do it and I should be able to. It literally can't be done. I don't have enough hours in a day. I don't have enough energy. And the problem is over here. It's not in me. It's not a problem of myself. So that's not a change that's going to work for everybody and solve everybody's problems. But there are little things that we can find that do make a difference in how we communicate to other people, and that can diminish the kind of the voices of those drivers. See a couple more comments in the chat. Great comment from Jason about, you might be, if you're working outside your comfort zone, you might be more vulnerable to these drivers, but you need to operate in that space to grow. Absolutely true, really good point. And it is something we need to be in balance for. But these are also drivers that can dominate our comfort zones as well. And sometimes being in one of these drivers can feel comfortable because it's known. The idea of wanting to please everybody can feel like a comfortable thing to do because we understand it. Even if it causes us stress or exhausts us, that can sometimes feel within our comfort zone. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic to play with. Sarah talks about try hard being really important, and prioritizing other things, and learning to reprioritize. I think it's a really nice example there, that idea of learning and change. And this is all muscle memory. It's just different types of muscles, and it changes over time. So that's the first of the exercises I wanted to talk through. Again, if you're happy for me to email you afterwards, I'll share a bit more detail about that. But again, I really recommend that as something that you take away and do separately, spend a little bit more time over and really start to dig down into what that means and do it with other people. I want to work through the second tool now. So I'm going to share my screen again. And so this is the last one. I want to spend a good kind of 20 minutes or so on this one before we wrap up. And this is a tool called the resilience tree. You can probably see immediately why it's called that, because it's a tree. It's not terribly opaque, this one. But how this breaks down, this is a tool to help understand the patterns in, okay, so we talked about burnout, and now we're talking about the resilience. Okay, so the good stuff. So what do we actually do to be resilient? And what this tool is really good for is for playing around with, okay, what are the things that give us resilience? So the roots of our resilience, but also what are the benefits of resilience, called the fruits here, which is sometimes a harder question to answer. And there's two parts to this. So the first part is literally just coming up with the answers to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of try and do some live annotating here, and we'll start with the roots. So what I invite you to do, and in the chat, or unmute and say out loud if you prefer, start thinking about, okay, what are the roots of your resilience? What are the things that give you resilience? And let's try and kind of one or two words, and I'll try and copy them down as quickly as we can. So there's no wrong answer to this. What are the things that give you resilience? Okay, fresh air, outdoors, great. Hope, lovely. Tai Chi, family. So if there's longer ones, I may well miss them. Family and friends, people, community, lovely. Sleep, good food. I saw there. Animals, walking, meditation. Great. Exercise, yoga. Yeah, really nice ideas. Let's get a few more in. Any other suggestions? Got food there. That's great. So any other? So again, so if you've got the obvious ones down, try and think of some of the less obvious ones, perhaps. Kindness. Yeah, that's great. Beauty. Yeah, really lovely. Holidays. Conversation. Yeah, lovely. Communication. Nature. If I've missed anyone, it's not that I don't think it's a good idea. I'm just trying to read them as quickly as I can. Ideas. Nice. Smiles. Yeah, lovely. Honesty. Laughter. Great. Adventure. Okay, great. Reading. Let's finish there. That's good. It's a really nice collection of ideas. So if you feel like this is a useful tool for you, when you do this by yourselves, definitely spend a bit more time on coming up with the ideas, because it's a really nice thing to do, is just coming up with a list of things that are nice. But what I want to do now is just spend a couple of seconds. Okay, think about, right. So we've got a really nice list of ideas here. And the roots of our resilience, we can generally split into kind of two categories. So I'm going to try and do this here and look at, okay, so let's say kind of Tai Chi, exercise, yoga, meditation, walking, maybe sleep, family and friends, food, animals, let's see what else, reading, fresh air, outdoors. There might be others, but so these ones I've highlighted in green. So these are things you can do kind of whenever you want. If I said, okay, tomorrow I want you to go for a walk or do some meditation or have some good food. Like generally, these are things we understand how to do. And obviously you can't always do all of these things. Then there might be some barriers to them, but they are things that we have control over to a large extent. Now, if we look at some of the other ones like adventure, laughter, honesty, ideas, communication, beauty, kindness, hope, these are ideas that they're much more connected to a kind of an intrinsic sense of who we want to be and what is important to us, but they're harder to go out and do. If I said, okay, tomorrow that go and get some honesty or go and have an adventure. You might have a good time trying to do that, but it's not as easy. You can't just go out and do these things. I see the point here from Rosie about, some of them, you might put these on different lists, and I've really just, very quickly broken this down. This is not a kind of an exact science. But the key thing here is you need a mixture of these ideas, right? Okay, you need the things that are things you can go out and do, but don't necessarily speak to some, really clear idea of why they're important. And the more abstract ideas like hope, like kindness, like beauty, that we really we're really drawn to, but we don't necessarily know how to get them. So we need a mix of these ideas. And it's interesting to notice, do we have more of one, the more of the other? But having a mix is really important. So I'll explain a little bit more why in a little bit, but let's focus now on the fruits of resilience. So this is sometimes a harder question to answer, but the question here is, okay, so what does resilience give you? So we've looked at what gives you resilience, and now we flip it around. So have a think again in the chat box. What are the benefits of resilience? Okay, great. Health, clarity, energy, calm, progression, coping, strength, confidence, ideas, courage. Great, I'll start another line here. Boundaries, that's a nice one. Well-being, chance to reevaluate, motivation, focus, creativity, purpose. These are some excellent ideas. Glee, what a lovely word that is. Internal vitality. Okay, survival, observation. Right, great. Let's finish up there. Some more ones coming in. Happiness, positive karma, joy. Yes, absolutely. Again, we could go on for ages, and again, this is a really nice just list of things to come up with. But again, as we've done with the first ones, again, there's now a chance to kind of look at, okay, well, how are these things different? So, and here the difference is looking at, okay, so our first list we're going to look at, which are things like okay, health, boundaries, creativity, maybe strength, coping, energy. And again, you might interpret these differently. This is a little bit harder one to do, but what I've started highlighting here are the ideas that we understand what they mean. We understand what benefit they will bring to us. Okay, so one of the challenges with the word resilience is generally we know that resilience is good. I mean, if I said, okay, who wants to be resilient, I'm giving out some resilience. No one's going to say, no, I don't want that. Yes, hands up, great, let's do that. But if I then say, okay, well, I'll do that, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you, 10 quid or 500 quid, or it's going to cost you 50 hours of your time. Then it's a very different question, because if we don't understand what resilience really means and the impact it will have on us, it's very hard to actually then prioritize it. So these are ideas that are maybe a little bit easier. So health, we generally can understand what the importance of health is to us, and energy. And so I've done this quite personally, but you might have a different experience. But creativity for me is something I can immediately see why creativity is valuable to me. And maybe that's because of the work that I do. And maybe you would look at another one of these things and say, right, I immediately know why that's important to me. And that might be a different one. But if we look at some of the other ones, so things like courage and focus, glee, some of the ones that we came up with the end there, like happiness as well, and joy, maybe clarity. These are maybe ideas that are a little bit like, again, I'm intrinsically connected to them. I really want these things. I know that they're important and they are motivators to act, but I don't necessarily know what that's going to mean to me. Okay, if I have more courage, what is that actually going to do? How will that impact me? It's something that I want. I'd love to have more glee, but I don't really know what that means, how that will impact me. And focus. And again, you might come at this in a completely different way. You might see some of those as some of the ones that I have highlighted in pink. You might look at and say, I don't really know how that will have an impact on my life. And again, the key thing here is that there are no wrong answers and there's no wrong way to do this. But it's about really digging into this and thinking, okay, so if I'm going to be able to actually prioritize my own resilience, I really need to understand what it's going to mean to me, what the impact of that resilience is going to be. And what we can start to do once we've done this is start making connections. So if we think about, okay, so maybe, for example, I want to do some exercise, and maybe that is going to help me kind of connect with kindness, for example. And then that might link up to this idea of that might give me more glee. And then if I've got more glee, that's going to give me more energy. And the point of this is not to oversimplify or patronize ourselves and say, oh, well, definitely if we do this, then it'll that and this and that, and that's the wonderful connection and everything's fine. It's not important what those connections are and what those links are. The key thing is we believe that there are connections, and there's an element of kind of a leap of faith, a trust that we have to go into here, whereby if we believe that we do these things at the bottom, these roots, that it will lead to the fruits. Because if we don't believe that, if we don't understand why these things are important, it'll be really, really hard to prioritize. So maybe, for example, some of these things at the bottom, Helen, I see your dog has made an appearance to give a perfect example here of spending time with animals is really nice, right? I mean, it gives us an immediate hit most of the time of kind of positivity. But beyond that, there are benefits beyond that. And we need to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, what's actually going on here? So question there, do you mean what I want resilience to do or what it could do? So this is about what resilience does do, because if we just think about it as what I want it to do, it's very hard to prioritize. And the reason here is that there's this idea called the myth of doing nothing. So this is something I see a lot of the time, and a really key barrier for people in prioritizing their own resilience. It's this idea of the myth of doing nothing. Because very often when we talk about these things at the bottom, the language we use is the language of doing nothing. We say, okay, what are you doing? Oh, nothing. I'm just going for a walk. Oh, just nothing. I'm having a nap, getting some sleep, or having a bite to eat, something like that. And again, it's irrational. There's no such thing as doing nothing, and we know that. We know it doesn't exist. What we mean when we say we're doing nothing is we mean we're doing nothing of consequence. But again, that's an irrational idea. Everything we do have consequence. What we really mean when we say we're doing nothing is we're doing nothing of consequence to other people. And that's what it really boils down to here, is that we are so conditioned to need and seek out feedback from the actions that we take that it's really, really hard to do things that don't give us that immediate feedback. And so this idea of doing nothing often translates into things that don't give us immediate feedback from other people. So again, if we look at this list at the bottom, some of them might give certain amounts of feedback, but a lot of them don't. There isn't an immediate benefit that we notice to those things. Maybe with doing exercise, doing something physical, there might be a slight bit of feeling positive about that, but it doesn't give us long-term feedback, because there's no one actually telling us, oh, I really like that thing that you did, or that was really helpful, thanks for doing that. And what this means is we might know what resilience means to us, we might know what gives us resilience, but it's very hard to prioritize it when we have all of these other things clamoring for our attention. Whether it's doing something for work, writing that email you've been meaning to send, or finishing that presentation, or maybe it's a domestic duty, keeping a family member warm and fed. Something where we get feedback from other people. We're naturally drawn to these things, which makes it really, really difficult to do the things that make us able to be well and exist and be resilient that don't give us that feedback. So what we need to do, and what this exercise is all about, is helping us recognize that feedback in ourselves. So I know that if I do one of these things at the bottom, it's going to have a positive impact. And I might not be able to connect it exactly to one of these ideas at the top, but I believe that it has an impact and that it is important and it will have a consequence. And that idea of consequence is so important, because this is where we come back to the drivers, which are all about external feedback and noticing it or misinterpreting it, but being very, very, very driven by feedback. All of those drivers are about feedback, but often feedback we give ourselves. So this is the positive pattern of that. This is the positive version of the positive feedback we give ourselves when we do something that we know is important. So another comment is, what if it is because you think the other person might put your action down, so sloth is less harmful as a reply? Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I'd be pleased to explain that in a bit more detail if you can. But there's definitely something in here about other people don't see the benefit of these actions a lot of the time. So yeah, if maybe we say we're doing nothing because it's playing down the importance of what we're doing. And it's hard to, but then it kind of, I think this is where you're getting to, is then it's very hard to defend that desire to do something. If you say, oh, I'm not doing anything, I'm just going for a walk, and someone says, oh, okay, well, could you come and, help me move house, or paint my wall, or send that email, or do that thing? And maybe you want to do that, and that's fine. It's not saying you can never do that, but it does mean it's very hard to defend or hold on to, actually, no, I need to go for this walk because it's really important to me. I need to read this book. I need to find this laughter or this beauty because it's important to me. It's very hard to kind of dig into that when we have other people asking for something and giving us that direct feedback. And again, this doesn't change overnight. This isn't an immediate shift, but this is a different pattern. It's building new patterns into the way that we kind of exist and work with other people. So it's a question about, am I over intellectualizing the way we access our inner being, our instinct? Yes, I am. And I think it's important to do that, but do it in a way that's not, again, oversimplifying. So it's saying, if we do this, it will lead to exactly that. It's not about overanalyzing our behavior. It's about drawing out these ideas so that we can believe that there is a benefit. So I think it's bringing in a bit of intellectualizing, but I don't think I think it stops short of going over intellectualizing it, because we don't want to have to justify these things to other people. If we had to justify them to other people, maybe we would have to say, no, I am going to go for this walk. I'm going to eat well because of X, Y, Z. But if we're justifying it to ourselves, we don't need to go that far. We can just believe it. We can trust that it is important. So I think that's a really important point you raised, and I really, really appreciate you doing it. And I would say, for any of you individually, if it feels like you're starting to over-intellectualize it, then that's a good kind of sign that maybe it's gone a little bit too far. And we all have to find our own levels with this. But yeah, it comes back to that, you really connect with what is important to you and find your own way of doing that. This is just one tool and one exercise that I found really helpful for me, and I've found very helpful for other people I've worked with over the years. But again, it's just a tool. It can be adapted, it can be changed for whatever works for you. And I think I've hopefully explained that enough. I'll stop sharing in a second. Before I do that, is there any kind of questions about anything that's directly on the screen that anybody wants to ask before I close that off? Or anything that doesn't make sense? I really welcome, if there are things about this that don't quite click or feel like they're not quite working, please do say, because this is something that has to be, it's all about believing it for yourself. I'm not telling you how to think. So it's a comment there. If you're like me and you put yourself down by diminishing your actions, it stops people asking you and you stop being proud of yourself. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, and again, a pattern, a negative pattern there can be really destructive. You know, can start off small, but yeah, is one that can be changed. So another couple of comments there. Some of the drivers tiring and repetitive, and yeah, some of these things, writing that down can get that stuff out of your head. So get a bit of perspective on it, notice those patterns, and kind of be less in the moment. Okay, I'm gonna stop my sharing my screen so we can come back together. And we've got kind of 5-7 minutes left. And I really wanted to keep this space for, again, just kind of reflecting on how we might put these things into practice. So I've shared a couple of tools there. Again, I'll just share, as I shared before, that link. If you want me to email you more detail about these, then please do just put your email in there, and I'll just use that to send the one email after this. But yeah, I wanted to kind of, again, invite any reflections, questions. You can put in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and share a particular perspective. I've been doing a lot of talking, and it's sometimes nice to hear a different voice in this, but again, no pressure. I appreciate we've all had a long few days. So any reflections on other ways this might be, you know, people can help recognize these patterns or find different ones, or different ways to apply a couple of the tools that I've been talking about. Again, I'll leave a little bit of space if anybody wants to fill it.
Peter, something I found really useful to learn was that if we're stressed and anxious, it changes the chemical bath of our body, and that can take weeks or months to change. And that when you're making these kind of changes with the tree, if you don't get immediate feedback, that doesn't mean you're not making positive changes. It just means you need quite a long period of time, perhaps as long as it's taken sort of wearing yourself out. So that I found really interesting learning about, just that literally the cortisol and adrenaline and everything else that's in your system when you're coping a lot, which is what we've all been doing, you've got to get other chemicals in your system. And for me, I had to just concentrate on literally sitting still, so watching telly or reading a book, like not productively doing something. Did a lot of doing things I enjoyed, but they were all still productive, and that wasn't giving me the right chemicals I needed to rebalance myself.
So yeah, really powerful. Yeah, I totally get that. And there's a couple of things in there that feel quite interesting. One is this idea of the word productive, and I know exactly what you mean when you say that. But one of the purposes of some of these exercises, I think, is to slightly reframe what productive means. And again, it's that some things are kind of that immediate productive where you get that external feedback and other people recognize as productive. But as you were exactly saying, staying in bed or on the sofa and kind of watching things and resting is also productive, because without that, we can't then do the other things. And I think that time element you brought into that is really, really important, and quite similar to some of the challenges in the climate movement as well. You know, one of the challenges with responding to the climate emergency is we don't get immediate feedback from the actions that we take. You know, if we do some recycling, we don't immediately see the temperature change, you know, in our community. And that's one of the real challenges of getting governments and businesses involved, is because it's delayed. So you know, these are very human challenges that we're facing that are not unique to us as individuals. They're very kind of societal challenges of, if we don't get immediate feedback, it's very hard to adapt and change accordingly, which is why some of these exercises and looking long term and noticing patterns over time is really our most helpful way, I think, of doing that. And I think that's a really important point you recognize. And maybe if we can look at these things over time, we can start to notice, okay, well, I'm starting to feel a little bit better here. What have I been doing recently over the past few months? Can I do more of that stuff? Because you're totally right. You know, the chemicals in our system do not change overnight, and it does make that a challenge. So thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts? I'll just have a look at what's in the chat as well. But any other thoughts, please do jump in. We've got a couple of minutes left. There's a comment from Julia in the chat. About the burnout rating scale I shared at the beginning, relating more to questions about emotional, mental feelings than physical ones. Does that vary person to person depending on their environment or job? Maybe. Yes, absolutely. And it will depend on the language that we're comfortable using in our work and with friends. We all have different kind of bubbles or circles or groups that we exist in, and we might be more comfortable talking about something. Some people might be more comfortable talking about physical changes. I've got a headache or I'm feeling a bit ill. Some people might feel more comfortable talking about emotions, and it's really important to notice those patterns that we are in, and which ones are helpful and which ones are not. And Sarah's point in the chat, admitting you're struggling is a massive thing as well. Absolutely. And it's so dependent on what the feedback you think you might get from that is. And again, that external feedback and internal feedback. So thank you so much for the comments there. It's really nice to see how these ideas kind of fit and bring up other things in other people. We're at time now, and I'm really conscious that there's the closing plenary in a couple of minutes. So I want to make sure everyone gets the chance to go to that. So thanks, Rachel, for sharing that. I'll add that link to the follow-up email. Again, one last time, in case you haven't got it, there's a form to fill in your email. If that doesn't work, feel free to message me in the chat. But thank you so much for joining. I really hope that was useful, and please do take and adapt and share those tools. They're completely open source. I'm not protective of any of them, and please do enjoy the closing of the conference. It's lovely to spend this hour with you all.